The rising sun was painting the São Paulo sky in shades of orange and pink when Miguel woke up that fateful morning. He stretched out on the narrow bed in his modest room, never imagining that that day would change his life forever. The 20-year-old ran a hand through his tousled brown hair and glanced at the clock on his bedside table. 30. He had exactly an hour and a half to prepare for the most important job interview of his life so far. Miguel got up with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. His green eyes, inherited from a mother he had never met, scanned the small bedroom in search of the suit he had picked out the night before. The one-room apartment he shared with 2 college friends was cramped, but it was what he could afford on his salary as a clerk in the neighborhood bookstore. While he was getting ready, Miguel couldn't stop thinking about Isabel, his adoptive mother. She had died just 3 months before, leaving a huge void in his heart. Isabel had raised him alone since he was a baby, always with great love and dedication despite the financial difficulties. Miguel missed her every day, especially at important moments like this one. Already dressed and ready to go out, the young man stopped in front of the small mirror hanging on the wall. His reflection showed a slim young man of medium height with delicate features that contrasted with the determination in his gaze. Miguel adjusted his tie and on impulse opened the drawer of the dresser next to him. He took out a small blue velvet box. Carefully, he opened the box, revealing a gold ring with a small emerald. It was the only memento he had of Isabel, something she had always worn and which, on her deathbed, she had made a point of giving to her adopted son. "Miguel, my darling," Isabel had said in a weak voice, holding her son's hand, "this ring, it's very special. It belonged to your real mother. Treasure it dearly. One day you'll understand." These were Isabel's last words before she left, leaving Miguel with more questions than answers about her origins. He had never known anything about his biological parents, and Isabel had always been coy when the subject came up. Now, looking at the ring, Miguel felt an inexplicable connection with his unknown past. Determined, he slipped the ring onto the ring finger of his right hand. "For you, Mom," he murmured, feeling a wave of confidence wash over him. With one last look in the mirror, Miguel picked up his briefcase and left to face whatever fate had in store for him. São Paulo's traffic was as chaotic as ever, but Miguel managed to reach the imposing Oliveira Incorporações building 15 minutes early. Standing in front of the glass and steel building that rose majestically in the heart of the city's financial district, he took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "You can do it, Miguel," he said to himself, entering the building's cool lobby. At the reception desk, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile welcomed him. "Good morning, what can I do for you?" "Good morning. My name is Miguel Santos. I have an appointment with Mr. Oliveira at 9 o'clock. The receptionist checked something on her computer and nodded. "Yes, here you are. Please take the elevator on the right to the 30th floor. Mr. Oliveira's secretary will see you there." Miguel thanked him and followed the instructions. As the elevator went up, he couldn't contain his anxiety. This interview could change his life. The position of executive assistant at Oliveira Incorporações was a unique opportunity for a recent business graduate like him. The elevator doors opened on the 30th floor, revealing an elegant hallway decorated with modern works of art. A young woman in an impeccable suit greeted him with a professional smile. "Mr. Santos, I'm Mariana, Mr. Oliveira's secretary. Please come with me." She led him through a maze of corridors until they came to an imposing dark wooden door. Mariana knocked lightly, and after a short moment opened the door. "Mr. Oliveira, Mr. Miguel Santos is here for the interview." Miguel entered the office, impressed by the panoramic view of São Paulo that stretched from the floor-to-ceiling windows. In the center of the room, behind a solid mahogany desk, sat a man of about 60 with gray hair and piercing eyes. Mr. Oliveira stood up to greet him, extending his hand. "Welcome, Mr. Santos. Please have a seat." It was at that moment that something extraordinary happened. When Miguel shook Mr. Oliveira's hand, the executive's gaze was drawn to the ring on his finger. Suddenly, all the color drained from the older man's face, and he staggered slightly. "Mr. Oliveira, are you all right?" Miguel asked, concerned. "Mr." Oliveira didn't answer immediately. His eyes, wide with shock, remained fixed on the ring. When he finally spoke, his voice was just a hoarse whisper. Where did you get this ring?" Confused by his interviewer's reaction, Miguel hesitated before answering. "This ring belonged to my adoptive mother. She gave it to me before she passed away a few months ago." Mr. Oliveira seemed to struggle to pull himself together. He sat down heavily in his chair, still staring at Miguel's hand. "Your adoptive mother. What was her name?" "Isabel. Isabel Santos," Miguel replied, increasingly intrigued by Mr. Oliveira's behavior. The executive closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the information. When he opened them again, Miguel saw something he hadn't expected. Tears. "Mr. Santos." "Miguel, Mr. Oliveira began, his voice trembling. "This ring, I gave it to my daughter Carolina over 20 years ago. She disappeared soon after, 8 months pregnant. We never saw her again." The shock of the revelation hit Miguel like a thunderbolt. He looked at the ring on his finger, then back at Mr. Oliveira, unable to fully process what he was hearing. What does that mean?" Miguel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Oliveira stood up, coming around the table to stand closer to Miguel. His eyes, now watery, scrutinized every detail of the young man's face. "It means, my boy, that you can be my grandson. The son my Carolina was carrying when she disappeared." The silence that followed was deafening. Miguel felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under his feet. His whole life, all the unanswered questions about his origins, seemed to converge on this moment. I don't know what to say," Miguel finally managed to articulate, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and thoughts. "Mr. Oliveira placed a hand gently on Miguel's shoulder. "I know it's a lot to take in. Believe me, I'm as shocked as you are. But if there's a chance, however small, that you're my grandson, we need to look into it." Miguel nodded slowly, still stunned. "Yes, of course. I always wanted to know about my biological parents. Isabel never told me anything." Mr. Oliveira returned to his chair, suddenly looking much older and tired. "Miguel, I think we need to talk. The job interview can wait. This is much more important." Over the next few hours, Miguel and Mr. Oliveira, who asked to be called Antonio, exchanged stories. Antonio talked about Carolina, his only daughter, who had mysteriously disappeared 20 years ago when she was about to give birth. He described the fruitless search, the years of anguish and the hope that never completely died. Miguel, for his part, told of his childhood with Isabel, the financial difficulties, but also the unconditional love she had always given him. He talked about how she avoided talking about her biological parents and how on her deathbed she had given him the ring with enigmatic words. As they talked, the similarities between Miguel and Carolina became more and more obvious to Antonio. The same green eyes, the shape of his face, even certain mannerisms reminded him of his lost daughter. "Miguel," Antonio finally said, "I know this is sudden and overwhelming, but I'd like to do a DNA test. If you really are my grandson, it will change our lives forever." Miguel hesitated for a moment, but curiosity and the desire to know his origins spoke louder. "I agree, Mr. Antonio, I want to know the truth too." That same afternoon, Antonio used his contacts to speed up a DNA test. The results would take a few days, but they both knew that their lives had already changed irrevocably. In the days that followed, while they waited for the results, Miguel and Antonio spent a lot of time together. The young man was introduced to the Oliveira mansion, an imposing property in Jardins, one of São Paulo's most exclusive neighborhoods. There he met Helena, Antonio's wife and possible grandmother. Helena was an elegant woman, her gray hair always impeccably groomed. When she met Miguel, she couldn't hold back her tears. "You have her eyes," she said, gently touching Miguel's face. "The same eyes as my Carolina." The mansion was full of photos of Carolina. Miguel spent hours looking at them, searching for similarities, trying to imagine what his life would have been like if he had grown up there, with his biological parents. One photo in particular caught his eye. It showed Carolina, clearly pregnant, smiling radiantly at the camera. She was wearing her ring, the same ring that was now on Miguel's finger. "That was the last picture we took of her," Antonio said, stopping next to Miguel. "It was taken a week before she disappeared." Miguel felt a lump in his throat. "What happened to her?" Antonio sighed heavily. "We'd like to know. One day she went out shopping for the baby and never came back. The police investigated for months but never found any concrete clues. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The mystery of Carolina's disappearance consumed Miguel. He couldn't stop thinking about his biological mother, everything she must have gone through, how she had missed the chance to see him grow up. And Isabel. What was her role in all this? How had she gotten the ring? Why had she never told Miguel the truth? These were days of intense reflection and emotion for Miguel. His life had been turned upside down in a matter of days. From a young man struggling to get his first real job, he now saw himself as the possible heir to one of São Paulo's greatest fortunes. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the results of the DNA test arrived. Antonio gathered Miguel and Helena in his office at the mansion to open the envelope. With trembling hands, Antonio tore open the envelope and began to read the contents. His face went through a series of emotions: anxiety, shock, and finally indescribable joy. "It's positive," he announced, his voice breaking. "Miguel, you are my grandson. You are our Carolina's son." The room exploded with emotion. Helena hugged Miguel, sobbing with joy. Antonio joined in, forming a circle of love and relief around the young man who until a few days ago had been a complete stranger. Miguel felt overwhelmed. On the one hand, he was happy to finally know his origins, to have found a family that loved him unconditionally. On the other, he couldn't help thinking about Isabel, the woman who had raised him, and the mysterious circumstances that had led him to her. "What happened to my mother?" Miguel asked when the hug finally broke. "With Carolina? Where is she now?" Antonio's smile faltered. "We don't know, Miguel. She's still missing. But now that we know you really are our grandson, we have a new lead to follow. Isabel Santos. We need to find out how she got the ring and how you ended up with her." Miguel nodded, determined. "We'll find out the truth. Together." Over the next few days, Miguel moved into the Oliveira mansion. Antonio insisted, saying that he wanted to make up for 20 years lost. For Miguel, it was like entering a completely new world. Suddenly, he had access to luxuries he had never imagined. A room bigger than the entire apartment he had lived in before, designer clothes, a chauffeur-driven car at his disposal. But more than the material goods, what really impressed Miguel was the love and affection he received from Antonio and Helena. They made a point of spending time with him, listening to his stories and really getting to know him. For Miguel, who had only grown up with Isabel, it was a new and exciting experience to have such a present family. However, despite the happiness of having found his biological grandparents, Miguel couldn't forget the mystery surrounding his birth and the disappearance of his mother, Carolina. He and Antonio spent much of their free time investigating the past, looking for any clue that might lead them to Carolina or explain how Miguel had ended up with Isabel. One afternoon, while rummaging through old files in the mansion's library, Miguel found a dusty box hidden behind a bookcase. Inside were a series of newspaper clippings related to Carolina's disappearance. "Antonio, look at this," Miguel called out, spreading the clippings out on the table. Antonio approached, adjusting his glasses to read the yellowed articles. One of them immediately caught his eye. "Witness claims to have seen missing pregnant woman in seaside town," he read aloud. This is from a few weeks after Carolina's disappearance. How have I never seen that before?" Miguel examined the article. It says that a witness claimed to have seen a woman who looked like Carolina in a town called Porto Seguro in Bahia, but the police were unable to confirm the information. Antonio looked stunned. "I vaguely remember it now. We were so desperate at the time, following any possible lead, but nothing ever materialized." Miguel felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. What if it's true? What if my mother really was in Porto Seguro? Maybe there are still clues there. Antonio nodded slowly, a new determination shining in his eyes. "You're right, Miguel. We can't leave any stone unturned. Let's go to Porto Seguro." Over the next few days, Antonio and Miguel planned their trip to Porto Seguro. Helena insisted on accompanying them, not wanting to be left behind in the search for her lost daughter. Meanwhile, Miguel couldn't stop thinking about Isabel. How did she fit into this story? Did she know more than she had told? He remembered how nervous she always got when he asked about her biological parents. The day before the trip, Miguel decided to visit the old apartment where he lived with Isabel. He still kept the key, unable to completely let go of that part of his life. The apartment was exactly as he had left it, small and modest, but full of memories. Miguel walked around the rooms, touching the worn furniture, looking at the pictures on the walls. In one of them, he and Isabel were smiling in a park. He must have been about 5 at the time. It was then that he noticed something strange. Behind the photo, partially hidden by the frame, was a folded piece of paper. Curious, Miguel carefully removed the photo from the wall and picked up the paper. It was a letter, handwritten in shaky handwriting that he recognized as Isabel's. With his heart racing, Miguel began to read, "My dear Miguel, if you are reading this, it means that I didn't have the courage to tell you the truth when I was alive. Forgive me, my son. I loved you with all my heart from the first moment I saw you, but the truth is that you didn't come to me the way I always told you. 20 years ago, I was working as a nurse in a hospital in Porto Seguro. It was there that I met Antonio, not your adoptive father, but a cruel and ambitious man. He arrived at the hospital with a pregnant woman. She was frightened, confused. Her name was Carolina. Antonio offered me an absurd amount of money to help him hide Carolina, and when the baby was born, to give it to him. I was desperate at the time, with debts I couldn't pay off. I accepted, to my eternal shame. But when you were born, Miguel, I couldn't give you away. Carolina begged me to save you from Antonio. She gave me the ring, saying that one day he would take you back to your real family. I ran away with you, Miguel. I left everything behind and started a new life in São Paulo. I spent years looking over my shoulder, fearing that Antonio would find us. As for Carolina, I don't know what happened to her after she was born. Antonio took her away, and I never saw her again. I know you must be angry, confused, and hurt. All I ask is that you try to understand that everything I did was out of love for you. You are and always will be my son, no matter what happens. Find your real family, Miguel. They deserve to know the truth, just like you do. With all my love, Isabel." Miguel dropped the letter, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Tears streamed down his face as he tried to process the shocking revelation. Isabel was not the villain he had begun to imagine. She had saved him, loved him, dedicated her life to protecting him. But now there was a new mystery. Who was this Antonio? What did he want with Carolina and the baby? With a heavy but determined heart, Miguel put the letter in his pocket. He had a new mission now, not only to find his biological mother, but also to discover the truth about this mysterious Antonio and his role in Carolina's disappearance. The next morning, when he boarded the Oliveira's private jet to Porto Seguro with Antonio and Helena, Miguel carried with him not only the hope of finding his mother, but also the weight of the newly discovered truth. The journey to Porto Seguro was tense and silent. Miguel debated internally whether or not to share the contents of Isabel's letter with Antonio and Helena. On the one hand, they had a right to know. On the other, he feared that the revelation might hinder the search for Carolina. When the plane landed at Porto Seguro's small airport, Miguel made up his mind. He would tell his grandparents everything, but only after they had investigated a little further. First, they needed concrete clues. The humid heat of the Bahian coast welcomed them as soon as they landed. Antonio had rented a luxurious beach house to serve as a base of operations during the investigation. As they settled in, Miguel couldn't help but notice the contrast between the opulence around them and the simple life he had led with Isabel. The next day, they began their search. Antonio used his contacts to arrange meetings with retired police officers who had worked on Carolina's case 2 decades ago. Meanwhile, Miguel and Helena visited hospitals and clinics in the area, hoping to find some record of a pregnant woman admitted 20 years ago. Days passed without any significant progress. The frustration was palpable, especially in Antonio, who seemed to age with each new dead end. It was during one of these discouraging nights that Miguel decided to take a walk alone along the beach. The sound of the waves breaking on the sand calmed him, reminding him of the rare walks he used to take with Isabel as a child. Lost in thought, Miguel barely noticed when an elderly figure approached him. It was a man with sunburnt skin and white hair tousled by the sea wind. "The young man seems lost to me," the old man commented with a gentle smile. "Not in direction, but in thought." Miguel smiled back, surprised by the stranger's insight. "I guess I really am. I'm looking for answers, but all I find are more questions." The old man nodded sagely. "Sometimes the answers are right under our noses. You just have to look with the right eyes. Something in the way the man spoke intrigued Miguel. Are you from here? Have you lived in Porto Seguro for a long time? Oh yes, the old man laughed. I was born and raised here. I've seen this city change a lot over the years. I've seen many stories unfold on these beaches. Miguel felt his heart race. Perhaps this man might know something. By any chance, Miguel began hesitantly, do you remember something unusual that happened about 20 years ago? Perhaps involving a pregnant woman? The old man's smile faltered for a moment. His once warm eyes took on a cautious gleam. Why is the young man asking about this? He asked, his voice now lower. Miguel decided to take a chance. He took the ring off his finger and showed it to the old man. This ring belonged to my biological mother. She disappeared 20 years ago when she was pregnant with me. We have reason to believe that she may have been here in Porto Seguro at the time. The old man stared at the ring, his face a mask of shock and recognition. My God, he muttered, I remember that ring. The girl, she was wearing it when she arrived here. Miguel felt as if the world had stopped spinning. Did you see her? Was my mother here? The old man nodded slowly. Yes, I saw her. She arrived with a man. She looked scared, confused. The man took her to an isolated house on the beach. A few days later, I heard screams coming from there. When I went to check, I saw an ambulance leaving in a hurry. I never saw the girl again, but the man stayed here for a while. Miguel could hardly breathe. Finally, a concrete clue. Do you know which hospital the ambulance went to? Or the name of the man who was with her? The old man frowned, trying to remember. The hospital must have been Santa Helena. It was the only one in the area at the time. As for the man, I'm not sure, but I think I heard him called Antonio once. The name hit Miguel like a punch in the gut. Antonio. The same name mentioned in Isabel's letter. It couldn't be a coincidence. Thank you, Miguel said to the old man, his mind spinning with the new information. You have no idea how much this means to me. The old man smiled sadly. I hope you find what you're looking for, young man, but be careful. Some truths can be painful to discover. With these enigmatic words, the old man walked away, leaving Miguel alone with his swirling thoughts. That evening, unable to contain his anxiety, Miguel shared his discoveries with Antonio and Helena. He told them about the encounter on the beach, about Isabel's letter, and about the mysterious Antonio mentioned in both accounts. Antonio was visibly shaken by the revelations. It can't be, he muttered, running his hand through his grey hair. Antonio, that name. I know him. Miguel and Helena looked at him surprised. What do you mean you know him? Helena asked, her voice trembling. Antonio sighed heavily. Antonio Mendes. He was my business partner many years ago. We had a serious disagreement shortly before Carolina's disappearance. He was always obsessed with power and money, but I never imagined that he could be involved in that. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with terrible implications. Miguel was the first to break it. We need to go to St. Helena Hospital tomorrow, he said resolutely. If my mother was admitted there 20 years ago, there must be some record. Antonio and Helena agreed, both with expressions of determination mixed with apprehension. The next morning, the trio headed to St. Helena Hospital. Using his influence and resources, Antonio gained access to the hospital's old archives. They spent hours going through dusty records, looking for any mention of Carolina or an unidentified patient who had been admitted 20 years ago. It was Helena who finally found something. Here, she exclaimed, holding up a yellowed chart, an unidentified patient admitted in premature labor exactly 20 years and 9 months ago. Miguel and Antonio crowded around her, eagerly reading the document. The physical description matched Carolina. The baby, a boy, had been born healthy despite his prematurity. It's me, Miguel whispered, touching the paper reverently. I was born here. But the joy of the discovery was quickly overshadowed by the continuation of the report. The patient had suffered postpartum complications and had been transferred to a larger hospital in Salvador. The name of the hospital, however, did not appear in the record. It's a clue, Antonio said, his voice mixing hope and frustration, but it's still not enough. At that moment, an elderly nurse going through the file stopped, puzzled by the trio's agitation. Excuse me, she said shyly. I couldn't help overhearing. Are you looking for information about a birth 20 years ago? The three turned to her, hopeful. Yes, Miguel replied. Do you remember anything? The nurse frowned thoughtfully. I was on duty that night. I remember because it was a strange case. The girl arrived unconscious, brought in by a man who claimed to be her husband. But there was something wrong. He seemed too nervous. Do you remember where she was transferred? Antonio asked anxiously. The nurse shook her head. Not officially. But she lowered her voice, looking around as if she feared being overheard. I heard the man talking on the phone. He mentioned something about taking the woman. The nurse continued, her voice low and cautious. He mentioned something about taking the woman to a private clinic in Salvador. I remember because I thought it was strange. Why wouldn't he take her to a public hospital, which would be standard procedure? Miguel, Antonio, and Helena exchanged meaningful glances. This could be the clue they were looking for. Do you remember any more details? Miguel asked anxiously. Anything about the man or the name of the clinic? The nurse frowned, struggling to remember. The man, he was tall, well-dressed, he looked rich, and he had a different accent, maybe from São Paulo. As for the clinic, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name, but I'm pretty sure it was in the Barra district of Salvador. Antonio nodded, thanking the nurse. That's very valuable information. Thank you. Leaving the hospital, the trio were excited but also apprehensive. They had a new lead, but also confirmation that Antonio Mendez, Antonio Oliveira's ex-partner, was definitely involved in Carolina's disappearance. We need to go to Salvador, Miguel said, determined. It's our best chance of finding out what happened to my mother. Antonio agreed. I'll make the necessary arrangements. We'll leave early tomorrow morning. That night, as they prepared for the journey, Miguel couldn't sleep. His mind was filled with questions and hypothetical scenarios. What would have happened to his mother after giving birth? Why had Antonio Mendez taken her? And most importantly, was she still alive? The next morning, they boarded a short flight to Salvador. When they arrived, Antonio immediately hired a team of private investigators to help search for private clinics in the Barra neighborhood that had existed for 20 years. While the investigators worked, Miguel, Antonio, and Helena walked the streets of Barra, showing photos of Carolina and asking old residents if they recognized her. It was a frustrating day with no concrete leads. In the late afternoon, exhausted and discouraged, they returned to the luxury hotel where they were staying. It was then that they received a call from the investigators. We've found something, said the voice on the other end of the line. An old private clinic that was closed about 15 years ago. We managed to track down a former employee who remembers a patient matching Carolina's description. Miguel's heart raced. Where can we find this former employee? Armed with the address provided by the investigators, they headed to a residential neighborhood on the outskirts of Salvador. There they met Ricardo, a middle-aged man who had worked as a security guard at the clinic in question. Yes, I remember her, Ricardo confirmed, looking at Carolina's photo. She arrived unconscious, brought in by a man. She was hospitalized for weeks. And then? Antonio asked anxiously. What happened to her? Ricardo hesitated, looking uncomfortable. Look, I shouldn't talk about it. I signed a confidentiality agreement at the time. Miguel leaned forward, his eyes pleading. Please, sir. That woman is my mother. I've never met her. I need to know what happened to her. The man looked at Miguel for a long moment, then sighed. All right. The truth is that clinic wasn't exactly what it seemed. They kept some patients against their will. Your mother was one of them. The revelation dropped like a bombshell. Helena choked back a sob while Antonio visibly paled. Against their will, Miguel repeated, incredulous. Are you saying she was being held prisoner? Ricardo nodded sadly. The man who brought her in, he was powerful. He had connections. He was paid handsomely to keep everything secret. And what happened to her? Antonio asked, his voice trembling. She stayed there for years, Ricardo replied. She tried to escape several times, but they always brought her back. Until one day, she just disappeared. No one knew if she had managed to escape or if... He left the sentence hanging in the air, the implied meaning hanging heavily over everyone. Miguel felt as if the ground had disappeared from under his feet. His mother, held prisoner for years, possibly dead. It was too much to process. "That man," Antonio said, his voice now harsh. "Do you know who he was?" Ricardo hesitated again, but Miguel's determined gaze convinced him to continue. "His name was Antonio Mendez. He came regularly to see the patient." Antonio let out a strangled sound, a mixture of anger and pain. "That bastard," he muttered. "He did it for revenge against me." Miguel looked at his grandfather, confused. "What are you talking about?" Antonio looked aged, the weight of guilt visible on his slumped shoulders. "Antonio Mendez and I were partners. We had a serious disagreement. I kicked him out of the company, ruined his reputation. He swore revenge. I never imagined, oh God, what have I done?" The silence that followed was heavy with conflicting emotions. Miguel struggled to process everything he had discovered. His mother, held prisoner for years because of a vendetta against his grandfather. It was almost too much to bear. But one question still hung in the air, a spark of hope in the midst of despair. "Ricardo," Miguel said, his voice shaky but determined. "You said that my mother has disappeared. Is there any chance that she's still alive?" Ricardo looked at the young man, compassion evident in his eyes. "Honestly? I don't know. But if she managed to escape, well, she was a strong woman. If anyone could survive, it would be her." These words ignited a flame of determination in Miguel. His mother had survived for years in captivity. She had fought, and now it was his turn to fight for her. "We'll find her," he said, looking at Antonio and Helena. "No matter how long it takes, no matter what it takes, we'll find my mother and bring her home." Antonio nodded, the guilt in his eyes giving way to determination. "Yes, we will. And we're going to make Antonio Mendez pay for what he's done." As they left Ricardo's house, Miguel felt a mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, hope. But above all, he felt an unshakable resolve. His journey was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. With this new information, the search for Carolina took on a new sense of urgency. Antonio mobilized all his resources, hiring the best private investigators in the country. He also contacted former colleagues in the police, seeking to reopen the case of Carolina's disappearance with the new evidence. Miguel, for his part, plunged headlong into the investigation. He spent days and nights studying every detail of the case, looking for any clue that might have been overlooked. His determination was fueled not only by the desire to find his mother, but also by the need to fully understand his own story. Helena, although devastated by the revelations, became a constant source of emotional support for Miguel and Antonio. She reminded them to take care of themselves in the midst of the frantic search, making sure that they ate and rested properly. Weeks passed, and the investigation took them on a circuitous route through Brazil. They followed leads in several cities, interviewed dozens of people, and scoured countless records. Each new piece of information brought them a little closer to the truth, but Carolina still remained elusive. It was during one of these searches that Miguel made a surprising discovery. While investigating Antonio Mendez's old businesses, he found records of a remote property in the interior of Minas Gerais. The property had been bought under a false name, but the dates coincided with the period when Carolina had disappeared from the clinic in Salvador. "It may just be a coincidence," Antonio said when Miguel shared his discovery, "but it's the best lead we have at the moment." Without wasting any time, they set off for Minas Gerais. The property was in an isolated area surrounded by mountains and dense vegetation. When they finally arrived after hours of driving along precarious roads, they found an abandoned farmhouse. Miguel's heart beat frantically as they approached the house. Could his mother be there? Or would they find just another dead end? The house had clearly been uninhabited for years, with broken windows and peeling paint. But as soon as they entered, it was clear that someone had lived there recently. There was dust-covered furniture, dishes in the kitchen sink, clothes still hanging in the closet. "Someone lived here," Helena said, her voice a reverent whisper. "And not that long ago." As they searched the house, Miguel felt an inexplicable connection with the place. It was as if he could feel his mother's presence there, even though she was no longer there. It was in the master bedroom, that they found the evidence they were looking for. Hidden under a loose floorboard was a diary. Miguel opened it with trembling hands, immediately recognizing the handwriting he had seen on old photos of cards written by Carolina. "It's hers," he said, his voice laced with emotion. "It's my mother's diary." The pages of the diary told a story of courage and resistance. Carolina had documented her years of captivity, her fight against Antonio Mendez, and finally, her escape. The last entries were from just a few months ago. "She's alive," Miguel said, tears of joy and relief streaming down his face. "My mother is alive and somewhere out there." The last diary entry mentioned Carolina's plans to go abroad, fearing that Antonio Mendez might still be looking for her. She mentioned a friend in Portugal who could help her start over. With this new information, Miguel's search gained momentum. They returned to São Paulo, determined to trace Carolina's whereabouts in Portugal. Antonio used his international contacts to start a discreet search, fearful of alerting Antonio Mendez. Meanwhile, Miguel decided it was time to confront the man responsible for so much suffering. With the help of private investigators, they tracked down Antonio Mendez living in a luxurious mansion on the outskirts of São Paulo. The confrontation was intense. Antonio Mendez, now an elderly man, but still with an air of arrogance, initially denied everything. But faced with the evidence presented by Miguel and Antonio Oliveira, he finally broke down. "I just wanted revenge," he admitted, his voice a mixture of anger and regret. "Oliveira took everything from me. I wanted him to feel the same pain." Miguel looked at the man with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You stole 20 years from my mother, 20 years that I could have spent with her. How could you do that?" Antonio Mendez had no answer. In the end, he was taken away by the police, facing charges of kidnapping and private imprisonment. With Antonio Mendez out of the way, the search for Carolina in Portugal could continue without fear of interference. It was a slow and often frustrating process, but Miguel refused to give up. Finally, after months of searching, they had a breakthrough. A woman matching Carolina's description had been spotted in a small coastal town in northern Portugal. Wasting no time, Miguel, Antonio and Helena boarded the first flight to Portugal. With his heart in his throat, Miguel approached the house indicated. It was a simple building, painted a faded blue with flowers in the windows. He hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door, a lifetime of hopes and fears converging on this moment. The door opened slowly, and there, standing before him, was Carolina. Her hair was grey now, and there were worry lines on her face, but her eyes, the same green eyes Miguel saw every morning in the mirror, shone with an unwavering inner strength. For a long moment, mother and son looked at each other in silence, decades of separation and longing reflected in their gazes. "Miguel?" Carolina finally whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Mom!" Miguel replied, tears streaming freely down his face. In that instant, all barriers crumbled. Carolina pulled Miguel into a tight embrace, sobbing uncontrollably. Miguel hugged her back, feeling as if a part of himself that had always been missing had finally been found. Antonio and Helena watched the scene from a distance, their own tears flowing freely. After a long moment, Carolina finally pulled away, holding Miguel's face in her trembling hands. Her eyes roamed over every detail of her son's face, as if trying to recapture all the lost years in a single glance. "My son," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. "My boy, you found me." Miguel smiled through his tears. "I never gave up looking for you, Mom. Never." It was then that Carolina noticed Antonio and Helena standing a few meters away. Her eyes widened in recognition, and a complex mixture of emotions crossed her face: joy, fear, uncertainty. "Dad? Mom?" she called out hesitantly. Antonio stepped forward, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. "Carolina, my daughter, forgive us for not finding you sooner. Forgive me for everything." Carolina looked at her father for a long moment, decades of pain and separation weighing between them. Then, slowly, she held out her hand to him. Antonio took it, sobbing openly now. "Let's go in," Carolina said softly. "We have a lot to talk about." Inside the small blue house, the reunited family sat in the modest but cozy living room. Carolina poured tea, her hands still trembling slightly as she held the kettle. "I never thought this day would come," she said, finally sitting down. "After so long, I had given up hope." Miguel took his mother's hand. "Tell us everything, Mum. What happened after you ran away from the clinic?" Carolina took a deep breath, her eyes straying into painful memories. "After I managed to escape, I lived in constant fear, always looking over my shoulder, afraid that Antonio Mendez would find me. I spent years hiding, moving from town to town." She paused, taking a sip of tea before continuing. "But the worst part was the pain of not knowing what had happened to you, Miguel. My baby. I prayed every night that you were safe and loved." Miguel felt tears return to his eyes. "I was, Mum. Isabel, she raised me with so much love." A sad smile touched Carolina's lips. "Isabel, she was a good woman. I knew I could trust her to look after you." Antonio, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "Carolina, I'm sorry. All this happened because of me. If I hadn't been so hard on Antonio Mendez..." Carolina looked at her father, years of hurt and pain reflected in her eyes. But there was something else there too, understanding, and perhaps even forgiveness. "Dad," she said softly, "what Antonio Mendez did wasn't your fault. He made his own choices." Helena, who had remained silent, holding her husband's hand, finally spoke. "Daughter, we never gave up looking for you. All these years..." Carolina nodded, tears silently streaming down her face. "I know, Mum. I know." Miguel watched the interaction, his heart overflowing with emotion. His family, fragmented for so long, was finally reunited. But there were still so many questions, so many gaps to be filled. "Mom," he said gently, "how did you end up here in Portugal?" Carolina smiled, a little of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Oh, that was about 5 years ago. I had a friend here, someone I trusted. He helped me start over. This town, it reminded me a bit of Porto Seguro, the sea, the simple people. I finally felt safe here." The conversation continued well into the night. Carolina talked about her years of captivity, her courageous escape, the years of loneliness and fear. Miguel spoke about his childhood with Isabel, about how he discovered the truth, about the tireless search that led him there. Antonio and Helena shared their own journey, the years of fruitless searching, the pain of loss, the joy of finding Miguel, and finally, the overwhelming emotion of reuniting with the daughter they thought they had lost forever. As the night progressed, the intense emotions began to give way to a feeling of peace and hope. The family, separated for so long, was finally reunited. "What happens now?" Miguel finally asked, looking around at his newly reunited family. Carolina smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "Now, my son, we start again together." Antonio nodded, holding his daughter's hand. "Come back with us to Brazil, Carolina. There's nothing more to fear. Antonio Mendez is in jail. You can have your life back." Carolina hesitated, looking around at the simple house that had become her refuge. "I don't know. This town has become my home." "Then we'll come here," Miguel said impulsively. "Or you can come and visit us." "The important thing is that we're together now." Helena smiled, tears of happiness in her eyes. "Your son is right, dear. The important thing is that we're a family again. The rest, we'll sort out together." Carolina looked at each of them, her lost and now found son, her parents who had never given up on her. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, let's work it out together." That night, as the family talked, laughed and cried together, the wounds of the past began to heal. The future, once so uncertain and frightening, now seemed full of possibilities. Miguel looked out of the window, seeing the reflection of his reunited family in the glass. The ring on his finger, the ring that had started this whole journey, shone in the soft light of the room. He smiled, feeling complete for the first time in his life. Their story, a story of loss, search and redemption, was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, years of separation to overcome, trust to rebuild, but now they would face it all together, as the family they should always have been. And so, in the little blue house by the sea, a new chapter began, a chapter of healing, of love and above all of hope. If you're watching this far, it means you're enjoying the story, so please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. Returning to the story, in the days that followed, the Oliveira family plunged into a process of reconnection and healing. Carolina, after much reflection, decided to return to Brazil with her family. The decision wasn't easy. She had built a peaceful life in Portugal, far from the painful memories of the past. But the desire to make up for lost time with her son and parents spoke louder. Returning to Brazil was a surreal experience for Carolina. São Paulo, the city she had left so many years ago, was unrecognizable in many ways. The skyscrapers seemed taller, the streets busier, the pace of life more frenetic than she remembered. But in the midst of all this change, there were things that remained unchanged. The love of her family, now stronger than ever. The familiar smell of coffee in the morning. The distant sound of the bells from the church she attended as a child. For Miguel, having his mother back was like rediscovering a part of himself that he didn't even know was missing. He would spend hours talking to Carolina, absorbing every story, every detail of her life. Sometimes they were happy stories, memories of his own childhood, special moments with his grandparents. At other times, they were painful accounts of the years of captivity and escape. Miguel listened to everything, his heart filling with admiration for his mother's strength and resilience. Antonio and Helena, for their part, tried hard to make up for the lost years. They pampered Carolina as if she was still the little girl they had lost 2 decades ago. Sometimes this excessive attention was too much for Carolina, who had become accustomed to a life of independence and solitude, but she appreciated the love behind every gesture, no matter how clumsy. The adjustment wasn't easy. Carolina had frequent nightmares, reliving her years of captivity. Miguel often woke up to the sound of his mother's muffled cries and ran to comfort her. At these moments, the roles were reversed. The son became the protector, offering his mother the comfort she had never been able to give him during his childhood. Antonio, consumed by guilt, strove to redeem himself. He used his resources and connections to ensure that Antonio Mendes faced the full force of the law. The trial was a highly publicized event, bringing to light the shocking story of kidnapping and captivity that had remained hidden for so long. For Carolina, testifying against her captor was a terrifying but also cathartic experience. Facing Antonio Mendes in court, looking into the eyes of the man who had stolen so many years of her life, was a crucial step in her healing process. Miguel was by his mother's side throughout the trial, holding her hand and offering silent support. He watched with a mixture of pride and pain as his mother told her story, her voice shaking at first, but gaining strength as she spoke. When the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts, a weight seemed to be lifted from the shoulders of the entire Oliveira family. Antonio Mendes was sentenced to decades in prison, virtually guaranteeing that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. After the trial, the family decided it was time for a fresh start. They sold the mansion in São Paulo, with all its painful memories, and bought a house by the sea in a small coastal town. It was a place that reminded Carolina of her life in Portugal, offering the tranquility she needed to continue her healing process. Miguel left his job in the city to join the family. He started working remotely, spending his mornings writing on a balcony overlooking the ocean. In the afternoons, he and Carolina used to walk along the beach, talking about everything and nothing, building the mother-son relationship that had been denied them for so long. Antonio and Helena, although they kept a house in the city to take care of business, spent most of their time at the beach house. Antonio, in particular, seemed to flourish away from the stress of corporate life. He developed a new hobby, fishing, and often took Miguel with him on his morning expeditions. In the evenings, the family would gather for dinner on the veranda, the sound of the waves providing a relaxing soundtrack to their conversations. They were precious moments, full of laughter, sometimes tears, but always permeated by a deep sense of gratitude for being together again. One day, about a year after their reunion, Miguel found his mother sitting alone on the beach, watching the sunset. He joined her silently, respecting her moment of contemplation. After a few minutes, Carolina spoke, her soft voice almost lost in the sound of the waves. "You know, Miguel, for years I've dreamed of this moment. to be free, to be with my family. But it always seemed like an impossible dream. Miguel took his mother's hand, feeling the texture of the ring, the same ring that had started this whole journey, on his finger. But it wasn't impossible, Mum. We're here now. Carolina smiled, tears shining in her eyes. Yes, we are. And I'm so proud of the man you've become, Miguel. So grateful to have you in my life. Miguel felt his own heart fill with emotion. I love you, Mom, and I promise we'll never be apart again. Mother and son stood there watching the sun set over the horizon, the sky exploding in shades of orange and pink. It was a moment of perfect peace, a symbol of the new beginning they had achieved together. That evening, as the Oliveira family gathered for another candlelit dinner on the veranda, there was a palpable feeling of contentment in the air. They had been through so much, separation, pain, fear, but had emerged stronger, more united. Miguel looked around the table, his heart overflowing with love. His mother, Carolina, laughing at a joke Helena had just told. His grandfather, Antonio, with an arm lovingly around his wife's shoulders. This was her family. Imperfect, scarred by the past, but incredibly resilient and full of love. And as the conversation flowed and the laughter echoed into the night, Miguel knew with absolute certainty that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Because that's what families did. They forgave each other, healed each other, and above all loved each other unconditionally. The ring on her finger glowed in the candlelight, a constant reminder of the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. A journey of loss and discovery, of pain and healing, of separation and reunion. A journey that in the end proved that true love, the love of a family, could overcome even the most impossible odds.